There are moments in life when silence is louder than any siren. The forest road outside Millstone County had gone still in a way that didn't feel natural, as if the world itself had paused to listen, and in that uneasy quiet, an overturned ambulance sat half-angled against the gravel shoulder, its emergency lights flickering in tired red pulses that cut through the early morning fog. The air smelled faintly of damp pine and warm metal cooling too fast, a reminder that something urgent had happened here not long ago. A few hundred feet away, Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker slowed his steps as he approached the scene, his boots pressing into soft earth mixed with loose stone, his breath steady but alert in the cold air that measured about 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Beside him moved Rex, a German shepherd trained for military support operations, his sable coat catching faint streaks of light as his eyes stayed locked forward with an intensity that didn't waver for even a second. Rex wasn't behaving like he usually did on standard search protocols. There was no hesitation, no scanning for command, only a fixed focus toward the wrecked ambulance, as if he already knew something important was inside. Ethan raised a hand slightly, signaling caution without speaking, and continued forward until the full shape of the vehicle came into view, its rear doors slightly ajar, one side pressed down into the dirt as if the road had given up beneath it. A faint radio crackle still escaped from somewhere inside, broken and inconsistent, adding to the sense that time had stopped mid-response. From the opposite side of the road, headlights appeared through the mist, followed by the quick arrival of Dr. Melissa Grant, an emergency field physician assigned to regional response units. Her vehicle stopping at an angle on the shoulder before she stepped out with a medical kit already in hand, her expression shifting instantly from routine urgency to concern as she took in the scene. "What do we have?" she asked, her voice steady but lower than usual as she moved closer. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His attention was on Rex, who had stopped completely now, standing rigid beside the ambulance door, his ears angled forward and his posture locked in a way that suggested recognition rather than confusion. The dog let out a single low bark, not loud but deliberate, as if signaling something precise inside the vehicle. Dr. Grant stepped closer, scanning the exterior before noticing something unusual near the back wheels. Faint drag marks in the gravel and a broken medical tag clipped near the rear step, suggesting a transfer had been interrupted mid-route. "This was a patient transport," she said quietly, more to herself than to Ethan, her eyes narrowing as she checked the partially visible interior through the cracked door. Ethan placed one hand on the door frame and felt the faint warmth still lingering inside, a subtle reminder that whoever had been inside had been there only minutes before. Rex suddenly shifted, pressing his body closer to the door, his nose lowering as he inhaled slowly, then exhaled in a controlled rhythm, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Ethan glanced at him. "You know something's in there, don't you?" he said softly, though his voice carried no expectation of an answer, only acknowledgement of instinct. Dr. Grant adjusted her grip on her medical bag and nodded toward the rear latch. "If there's anyone inside, we don't have time to wait for backup." The three of them moved in coordination without formal instruction, as if the situation itself had already assigned roles. Ethan braced his shoulder and applied steady force to the rear door, while Dr. Grant prepared for immediate triage, and Rex stood directly beside the opening, his presence unusually calm now, no longer alert in a frantic sense, but focused in a way that felt almost protective. With a final push, the door gave way, releasing a quiet rush of cooler air from inside the ambulance, carrying with it the faint sound of a regular movement deeper within. Dr. Grant leaned in first, her eyes scanning carefully, and then her expression changed, subtle but immediate, as she confirmed what Rex had already been indicating. "We have a patient," she said, her voice firm but controlled, stepping aside to allow Ethan full access. Inside, partially secured on a stretcher, was a young boy, no older than 10, his name tag identifying him as Noah Carter, his condition stable but fragile, his eyes half open as if caught between awareness and exhaustion from the shock of the transport disruption. A monitoring device near his side blinked irregularly, showing that something had interrupted the normal rhythm of care, likely during the incident that brought the ambulance here. Rex immediately lowered his head to the edge of the stretcher, not touching the boy at first, simply staying close as if establishing presence, while Ethan carefully assessed the situation and Dr. Grant moved in to check vitals with steady hands. For a moment, everything outside the ambulance faded, leaving only the soft mechanical beeping, the quiet breaths of the child, and the unmoving loyalty of a trained K-9 who had somehow known exactly where to stand before anyone else understood why. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes shifting from the boy to Rex, and in that brief silence, something unspoken passed between them, not instructions, not commands, but recognition that some arrivals happen before understanding ever catches up. The interior of the ambulance carried a silence that felt heavier now that it had been opened, as if the air itself had been holding its breath for too long. Dr. Melissa Grant carefully leaned inside, her movements precise and controlled, her eyes immediately tracking the boy's condition as she adjusted the portable monitor clipped near his wrist. The faint beeping stabilized for a moment, then wavered again, reflecting the fragile balance his body was holding onto. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker remained at the doorway, one hand still braced against the metal frame, his gaze moving between the child and Rex, who had now positioned himself closer than before, his body aligned parallel to the stretcher as though guarding an invisible boundary no one else could see. Heart rate is elevated but holding, Dr. Grant said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, her voice steady but carrying the weight of urgency that did not need to be spoken louder to be understood. Ethan nodded slightly, though his attention kept returning to Rex, whose behavior was no longer simply alert but deeply focused, as if he were reading something beyond the visible signs of distress. The German shepherd lowered his head until it was level with the boy's hand, not touching yet, just close enough that his presence could be felt, and for a brief moment, the child's fingers twitched, a small unconscious movement that did not go unnoticed. Dr. Grant paused, observing the reaction carefully, then adjusted the oxygen line with gentle precision while maintaining her calm rhythm. "We need to stabilize him before transport back to the hospital," she said, her tone measured, but there was an underlying concern that the rural environment and time delay had already complicated the situation. Ethan stepped slightly closer, scanning the interior more thoroughly now, noticing subtle details that had been missed in the initial urgency. A partially displaced medical chart, a sealed medication pouch that appeared unopened, and a secondary monitoring wire disconnected from its base unit. "Something interrupted the transport sequence," he said quietly, his voice low but analytical, shaped by years of field awareness rather than speculation. Dr. Grant followed his gaze and confirmed with a brief nod, her expression tightening slightly as she processed the implications without allowing panic to surface. Rex suddenly shifted again, this time placing one front paw gently on the lower edge of the stretcher, not forceful, not disruptive, but intentional, as if anchoring himself to the situation. The boy's eyes fluttered open slightly, unfocused at first, then gradually adjusting to the presence beside him. There was no fear in the expression, only confusion and exhaustion, the kind that comes after the body has been pushed beyond its normal limits. Ethan leaned in just enough to ensure the child could hear him clearly. "You are safe now," he said softly, his tone steady and calm, the words simple but deliberate, meant to ground rather than overwhelm. Dr. Grant checked the boy's pulse again, then repositioned the oxygen flow with careful attention to detail, her training guiding each movement with practiced efficiency. Outside the ambulance, the forest remained still, the fog slowly thinning as the early morning light began to shift, revealing more of the uneven road and scattered debris around the crash site. Rex remained completely still now, his eyes locked on the boy's face, not blinking for several seconds, as though measuring something unspoken in real time. Then, without warning, the child's hand moved again, this time more clearly, brushing lightly against the edge of the stretcher before settling closer to Rex's side. The German shepherd did not react with excitement or noise. Instead, he exhaled slowly and lowered himself slightly, aligning his body at the level of the boy's arm, maintaining contact through proximity rather than touch. Dr. Grant noticed the subtle change and frowned slightly in clinical observation, recognizing that the stabilization curve had shifted in a way that was not typical for standard recovery response in the field. "That is unusual," she said quietly, more reflective than concerned, as she checked the monitor again and confirmed the slight improvement in rhythm consistency. Ethan remained silent for a moment, his eyes moving from the equipment to Rex and then back to the child, sensing a pattern that logic had not yet fully explained. The boy's breathing steadied gradually, not fully stable, but no longer erratic, and the tension inside the ambulance softened just enough to allow the moment to feel less like crisis and more like transition. Rex kept his position without moving, his presence steady and grounded, as if he understood that leaving even slightly would break something fragile that had only just begun to hold together. The quiet inside the ambulance had shifted again, not into panic, but into a fragile balance that felt like walking across thin ice under a winter sky. Dr. Melissa Grant adjusted the oxygen line with slow precision, her eyes never leaving the boy's readings as she tracked every subtle fluctuation on the portable monitor. The numbers were still unstable, but no longer falling, as if something in the environment itself had changed the direction of his condition. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker remained at the doorway, his posture steady but his attention fully divided between the medical situation and Rex, who had not moved from the stretcher's side since the moment the boy had regained partial awareness. The German shepherd's breathing was slow and deliberate, his amber eyes fixed on the child with an intensity that was not aggressive, not anxious, but profoundly focused, as though he was listening to something no human instrument could detect. The boy, Noah Carter, shifted slightly for the first time in several minutes, his fingers curling faintly against the edge of the stretcher before relaxing again, his eyelids fluttering as he tried to maintain consciousness. Dr. Grant leaned closer, checking his pupils with a small pen light, her voice calm but more measured now. He is responding to stabilization, but the cause of the initial interruption is still unclear, she said, more to confirm her observations than to raise concern. Ethan nodded once, then stepped slightly closer, his boots pressing softly against the metal floor of the ambulance, his instincts trained by years of field operations picking up on details that did not belong in a standard emergency scenario. A small medical pouch lay partially unsealed near the boy's side, and a second diagnostic lead was disconnected from its original port, suggesting that the normal sequence of care had been disrupted mid-route. Rex suddenly lifted his head slightly, ears adjusting as if reacting to something subtle in the boy's breathing pattern. Then he shifted his position closer, aligning his body parallel to the stretcher in a way that mirrored protection rather than coincidence. Noah's breathing changed again, not in distress, but in rhythm, becoming slightly more consistent, and Dr. Grant immediately noticed the shift. "That is improving," she said quietly, her tone now carrying a hint of controlled surprise as she rechecked the monitor and confirmed the stabilization trend. Ethan observed the reaction carefully, then glanced at Rex, whose focus had not wavered even for a second. The dog lowered his head until it was almost level with the boy's hand again, and this time the child's fingers responded more clearly, lightly brushing against the edge of Rex's fur before settling again, as if acknowledging presence without fully waking. Dr. Grant paused for a moment, her clinical mindset analyzing the interaction, and then she quietly noted, "There is a neurological response to external stimulus, but it is unusually consistent." Ethan did not respond immediately, his attention locked on the interaction unfolding in front of him, sensing that what he was witnessing was not simply medical stabilization, but something more layered, something that did not fit within standard operational logic. Outside the ambulance, the forest road remained still, the early morning light growing stronger as fog slowly lifted from the ground, revealing scattered gravel and faint tire marks leading away from the crash site. Inside, the atmosphere had changed from urgency to controlled observation, each person adjusting to the unexpected stability forming around the child. Rex remained in position without hesitation, his body still and grounded, as if he had committed himself to maintaining a condition that no one had formally defined but everyone could now feel. The boy's eyes opened a little wider this time, not fully alert, but no longer lost in disorientation, and his gaze drifted toward Rex with faint recognition that did not yet have words attached to it. Dr. Grant checked the monitor once more, her expression softening slightly as the readings confirmed a slow but steady improvement. "We need to transport him within the next 10 minutes. She said, her tone returning to professional urgency, but now balanced with cautious optimism. Ethan stepped back half a pace, scanning the interior once more before looking at Rex, who remained completely still, his presence calm but unwavering. For a brief moment, there was no movement except the soft rhythm of breathing, the faint electrical hum of medical equipment, and the quiet understanding that something inside this small space had shifted in a way none of them had anticipated. The ambulance interior had settled into a delicate rhythm, where every sound felt amplified against the thin walls of metal and glass, and every breath carried more meaning than it should have. In a place like this, Dr. Melissa Grant continued her careful monitoring, her eyes moving between the portable vital screen and the child's subtle physical responses, noting each small improvement with clinical precision that masked the deeper caution behind her expression. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker remained positioned near the open door, his body angled slightly outward as he scanned both the interior and the surrounding forest road, trained instincts keeping him aware of variables beyond the immediate space. Rex, however, had not shifted from his position beside the stretcher, maintaining a stillness that felt intentional rather than passive, as though he had established a boundary that even time itself was not allowed to cross. Noah Carter's breathing remained steady but shallow, his eyelids now more consistently open, though unfocused, as he drifted between awareness and exhaustion. Dr. Grant checked the oxygen flow once more and then spoke in a low, steady voice. "We are maintaining stabilization, but we need controlled transport conditions as soon as possible." Ethan nodded once, then glanced briefly at Rex, whose eyes were locked on the boy with unwavering attention, tracking every subtle movement of his chest as if synchronizing with it. A faint change occurred when Noah's fingers moved again, this time more deliberately, brushing against Rex's fur with a softness that suggested recognition rather than random motion. The German shepherd did not react outwardly, but his posture adjusted slightly, lowering himself just enough to remain aligned with the boy's hand, reinforcing a sense of proximity that seemed to calm the child's breathing pattern further. Dr. Grant noticed this immediately and paused, her professional focus sharpening as she observed the correlation between the dog's presence and the stabilization curve on the monitor. "That is consistent," she said quietly, almost to herself, as she confirmed the gradual improvement in the oxygen saturation levels and heart rhythm stability. Ethan stepped slightly closer, his eyes moving between the equipment and Rex, recognizing patterns that did not align with standard medical expectation but could not be dismissed as coincidence. The boy's expression softened slightly, tension easing from his brow, as if the presence beside him had created a psychological anchor that allowed his body to respond more effectively to treatment. Outside the ambulance, the forest remained still, the early morning light now stronger, casting longer shadows across the gravel road and illuminating fragments of broken glass and scattered equipment near the crash site. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted again, not into urgency, but into focused observation, where each second felt like a measured step toward recovery. Rex remained entirely focused, his breathing slow and steady, his ears adjusting only slightly in response to Noah's subtle changes in rhythm, as if he were continuously calibrating his awareness to match the child's condition. Dr. Grant reviewed the monitor again, then spoke with a tone that carried both professional certainty and restrained curiosity. "If this trend continues for another 5 minutes, we can begin transfer preparation safely," she said, her hand steady as she adjusted the final reading parameters. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the boy, then briefly shifting to Rex, whose presence had not moved or weakened since the moment they had entered the ambulance. Noah's eyes opened a little wider again, and this time his focus sharpened slightly, drifting toward Rex with a faint but noticeable recognition that suggested emotional grounding even in his weakened state. The moment held steady, quiet, and unbroken, as if the environment itself had synchronized around a fragile equilibrium that none of them fully understood, but all of them were now protecting in their own way. The quiet inside the ambulance had evolved into something more stable, as if the entire space had adjusted itself to a new rhythm dictated not by emergency chaos, but by controlled recovery. Dr. Melissa Grant maintained her steady monitoring of Noah Carter's vital signs, her eyes moving with disciplined focus across each subtle fluctuation on the portable screen, confirming that oxygen saturation had risen into a safer range, and heart rhythm variability had decreased significantly over the last several minutes. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker remained positioned near the open rear door, his stance relaxed only in appearance, as his trained awareness continued to scan both the interior environment and the surrounding forest road, where morning light now filtered through thinning fog at an estimated visibility of nearly 200 feet. Rex continued to hold his position beside the stretcher, unmoving except for the controlled rhythm of his breathing, his body aligned in parallel with the boy's torso in a way that suggested intentional guardianship rather than coincidence. Noah's condition showed subtle but consistent improvement, his eyelids remaining open longer now, with more deliberate eye movement tracking faint shapes around him, especially the presence of the German shepherd beside him. Dr. Grant adjusted a final sensor lead and spoke softly, her tone measured but increasingly attentive to the unusual pattern she was observing. His neurological responsiveness is increasing at a rate that does not align with initial trauma projections, she said, more as a professional observation than a conclusion, while her fingers carefully recalibrated the monitor settings. Ethan shifted slightly closer, his gaze alternating between the equipment and Rex, recognizing that the stability being recorded was not following a standard recovery curve typically seen in pediatric transport cases under similar conditions. The boy's hand moved again, this time with more intention, slowly extending until his fingers lightly rested against Rex's fur, and the contact held steady rather than withdrawing, suggesting a form of grounding response that went beyond reflex. Rex responded by lowering his head a fraction, not in reaction but in synchronization, maintaining proximity at the exact level of the child's hand, as though preserving a fragile equilibrium that required no interruption. Dr. Grant paused for a brief moment, her expression tightening slightly as she reviewed the data once more, then quietly acknowledged, "There is a consistent stabilizing correlation between external proximity and physiological response." Ethan did not respond verbally, but his eyes remained fixed on the interaction, noting the absence of distress signals that would normally accompany such a critical recovery phase. The ambulance interior remained quiet except for the soft mechanical rhythm of monitoring equipment and the controlled breathing of the child, while outside, the forest road was now fully illuminated by early morning sunlight, revealing scattered debris and faint tire impressions that curved away from the crash site. Noah's breathing became more regular, and his facial tension eased further, suggesting that the immediate physiological crisis was transitioning into a monitored stabilization phase. Dr. Grant prepared a transport protocol adjustment, ensuring that the transition to the waiting medical unit would be executed without disruption to the current stability pattern. Rex remained entirely still, his focus unwavering, his presence functioning as a continuous stabilizing factor that neither Ethan nor Dr. Grant openly commented on beyond clinical observation. The boy's eyes briefly shifted upward, meeting the outline of Rex's face, and in that moment his expression softened again, not with full awareness, but with a calm recognition that seemed to anchor him more deeply into the present. Ethan exhaled slowly, his posture easing just slightly as he observed the sustained improvement, while maintaining readiness for immediate action if conditions changed. Dr. Grant confirmed the readiness for transfer, her voice calm but definitive as she prepared the final adjustment to move the stretcher safely out of the ambulance. For a brief moment, everything remained still, balanced between motion and pause, as if even the surrounding environment had adapted to the fragile stability inside the vehicle. The transition from observation to movement began slowly, as if the entire scene inside the ambulance was reluctant to break the fragile stability that had formed over the past several minutes. Dr. Melissa Grant carefully adjusted the stretcher locks, her movements precise and deliberate as she prepared for transport, ensuring that every connection, strap, and monitoring lead remained secure before any physical movement would occur. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker positioned himself at the rear opening, ready to assist with the controlled transfer, his posture steady but alert, his attention divided between the procedure and the surrounding environment outside the ambulance where morning light had now fully broken through the forest canopy. Rex remained beside Noah Carter, his body still aligned parallel to the stretcher, his focus unwavering, his presence unchanged despite the subtle shift in activity around him. The boy's breathing remained stable, and his eyes were open more consistently now, tracking movement with quiet awareness rather than confusion, as if gradually returning to full consciousness through a slow and careful ascent rather than a sudden recovery. Dr. Grant gave a final visual scan of the monitor and confirmed, "Vitals are stable for transport at controlled pace," her tone calm but firm, signaling that the critical phase had passed into a carefully managed window of safety. Ethan nodded once and moved to assist with the stretcher release, his hands steady as he coordinated with Dr. Grant to guide the equipment toward the exit. As the stretcher began to shift, Rex immediately adjusted his position, stepping forward just enough to remain within close proximity to Noah, refusing to break alignment even as the physical environment changed around him. Noah's hand remained lightly resting near Rex's fur, maintaining contact as the movement began, and his expression remained calm, no longer strained, but still fragile in its awareness. The stretcher rolled forward slowly, guided with controlled precision through the narrow opening of the ambulance, and the outside air entered in a soft wave, cooler and fresher, carrying the scent of pine and morning dew that had settled across the forest road. Ethan stepped backward carefully, ensuring the path was clear, while Dr. Grant maintained steady control over the medical equipment, watching the monitor continuously for any sign of instability during the transition. Rex moved in perfect synchronization with the stretcher, never falling behind or stepping ahead, maintaining a constant protective position at the boy's side, as if the boundary between patient and environment extended beyond physical space. Noah's breathing changed slightly again during the movement, but instead of destabilizing, it adjusted gradually, settling back into a steady rhythm within seconds, and Dr. Grant acknowledged the response with a brief nod of confirmation. The stretcher reached the ground safely, and the transfer to the secondary transport unit began immediately, with Ethan assisting in guiding the wheels over uneven gravel while maintaining stability. Rex followed without hesitation, staying close enough that his presence remained a continuous point of reference for the boy, who now turned his head slightly, as if instinctively aware of the connection. Dr. Grant observed this carefully, noting the consistent pattern of physiological stabilization coinciding with proximity, but she remained focused on ensuring that the transport procedure remained uninterrupted and safe. The secondary medical vehicle stood nearby, its rear doors open, interior prepared for continued monitoring and controlled care during transit to the regional medical center approximately 18 miles away. As the stretcher was carefully lifted into position inside the vehicle, Noah's hand shifted once more, lightly brushing Rex's fur before settling again, and the boy's expression showed a faint but noticeable easing of tension around the eyes and forehead. Ethan paused briefly, his gaze moving from the child to Rex, then back again, recognizing that the consistency of this interaction was no longer incidental but an active stabilizing factor within the entire medical process. Dr. Grant secured the final locking mechanism and confirmed readiness for departure, her voice steady as she gave the final clearance for transport. Rex stepped into the vehicle without being guided, positioning himself beside the stretcher once more, maintaining the same alignment as before, his presence uninterrupted despite the change in environment. The doors began to close slowly, and for a brief moment, the forest outside framed the interior scene in quiet stillness, as if holding onto the fragile balance that had been carefully established. Inside, all systems remained stable, all readings consistent, and all movement controlled, but the unspoken understanding between the boy and the German shepherd remained the most constant and unexplainable element within the entire unfolding situation. The interior of the transport vehicle had settled into a steady operational rhythm as it moved along the narrow forest highway, its suspension absorbing the uneven texture of the road while maintaining a controlled and stable environment for the patient. Dr. Melissa Grant remained seated beside Noah Carter, her eyes continuously scanning the portable monitoring system, which now displayed a consistent heart rate pattern and improved oxygen saturation levels compared to the initial emergency phase. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker sat opposite, positioned to maintain visual contact with both the medical setup and Rex, who had chosen a precise location beside the stretcher and had not deviated from it since boarding the vehicle. The German shepherd's posture remained calm, grounded, and fully attentive, his amber eyes fixed on Noah in a way that suggested sustained awareness rather than passive presence, as if tracking every subtle change in the child's condition in real time. Noah's breathing had stabilized further during transport, his eyelids now open more frequently, though still showing signs of fatigue, and his gaze occasionally drifted toward Rex before returning to a neutral resting position. Dr. Grant adjusted a small calibration on the monitor and spoke in a low, steady voice. All readings remain within stable range for continued transit, her tone reflecting professional confirmation rather than urgency. Ethan nodded slightly, then shifted his attention briefly toward the window, where the forest outside passed in a blur of green and gold as morning light strengthened across the landscape. The vehicle maintained a consistent speed of approximately 35 miles per hour, ensuring minimal vibration and controlled movement across the rural road conditions. Inside, the atmosphere remained focused and quiet, with only the soft hum of equipment and the steady rhythm of breathing filling the space. Rex remained completely still except for minor adjustments in head position, each movement subtle and deliberate, as though he was continuously aligning himself with the boy's breathing pattern. Noah's hand rested near the edge of the stretcher, occasionally brushing against Rex's fur in small, unconscious movements that appeared to provide a calming feedback loop, reflected in the gradual normalization of his vital signs. Dr. Grant observed this pattern carefully, her analytical focus deepening as she recorded the correlation between proximity and physiological stabilization, noting it in her internal report without disrupting the flow of care. Ethan leaned slightly forward, his voice low and controlled as he asked, "How far are we from the medical center now?" And Dr. Grant responded without looking away from the monitor, "Approximately 12 miles. Estimated arrival time 18 minutes under current conditions." The vehicle continued forward, passing through stretches of dense forest where sunlight filtered in narrow beams across the windshield, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that moved across the interior surfaces. Noah's breathing remained steady, and his heart rate showed only minor fluctuations consistent with normal recovery progression under controlled transport conditions. Rex's gaze did not waver, maintaining constant attention on the boy, his body positioned in such a way that any movement by Noah would be immediately within his field of awareness. At one point, Noah turned his head slightly more deliberately, his eyes briefly focusing on Rex's face, and in that moment his expression softened in a way that suggested recognition rather than confusion, as if the presence beside him had become a fixed point of comfort within an otherwise unfamiliar environment. Dr. Grant noticed the change immediately and documented the shift in responsiveness, her tone quiet but precise as she said, "There is continued improvement in neurological engagement and external stimulus recognition." Ethan remained silent for several seconds, processing the observation while maintaining awareness of the road conditions and the steady progression toward the destination. The transport continued without interruption, each system functioning within expected parameters, and the environment inside the vehicle remained stable despite the ongoing movement through uneven terrain. Rex remained in position throughout, unwavering in his presence, while Noah's condition continued its gradual and controlled stabilization, marking a transition from critical emergency response to monitored recovery in transit. The final stretch of the journey carried a different kind of tension, not urgency, but anticipation, as the medical transport vehicle continued along the narrowing forest highway toward the regional medical center, now less than 5 miles away. Inside, the environment remained carefully controlled, with Dr. Melissa Grant maintaining continuous monitoring of Noah Carter's vital signs, which had now stabilized into a consistent and predictable pattern, showing clear signs of sustained recovery under supervised transport conditions. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker sat in a steady posture across from the stretcher, his attention divided between situational awareness outside the vehicle and the quiet, unbroken presence of Rex beside the child. The German Shepherd remained perfectly aligned with Noah, his body positioned in a way that maintained constant proximity without restricting medical access, his focus unwavering and calm. Noah's breathing had become noticeably more even, and his eyelids now remained open for longer periods, with his gaze occasionally shifting toward Rex before settling back into a relaxed neutral position. Dr. Grant checked the monitor once more and spoke in a calm, professional tone. All vital indicators remained stable and within expected recovery thresholds for controlled transport. Ethan nodded slightly, then shifted his gaze toward the passing roadside, where the forest began to thin and signs of infrastructure appeared more frequently, indicating their approach to the medical facility. The vehicle reduced speed slightly as it approached a designated medical entry point, maintaining a smooth and controlled deceleration to avoid disrupting the patient's stability. Inside, the atmosphere remained steady, the soft hum of equipment blending with the sound of tires, transitioning from rough asphalt to a smoother paved surface. Rex adjusted his position slightly, not out of restlessness, but in response to Noah's subtle movement, ensuring that his presence remained consistent within the boy's immediate awareness. Noah turned his head a little more deliberately this time, his expression clearer than before, showing early signs of full cognitive engagement as his eyes briefly met Rex's gaze. Dr. Grant observed this carefully, noting the continued correlation between external presence and neurological responsiveness, and quietly documented the sustained improvement trend in her field notes. The medical facility came into view ahead, a low-structured building with designated emergency bays, marked clearly for incoming transport units, and staff members could already be seen preparing for arrival near the designated entrance. Ethan shifted forward slightly, preparing to assist with the final transfer procedure, his movements controlled and precise, ensuring readiness for immediate support if needed. The vehicle came to a gradual stop, and for a brief moment, the interior remained completely still, as if allowing the transition between motion and arrival to settle before any further action was taken. Dr. Grant secured the final monitor readings and confirmed, "We are stable for handoff," her voice calm and steady as she prepared for transfer protocol. The rear doors began to open slowly, revealing the medical bay team waiting outside with a stretcher and equipment prepared for immediate intake. Rex remained beside Noah without hesitation, maintaining his position as the environment changed around them, his focus still locked on the child, as if ensuring continuity through every stage of movement. Noah's hand shifted slightly once more, brushing against Rex's fur in a small but deliberate motion, and his expression remained calm, showing no signs of distress as the transition occurred. Ethan stepped forward to assist with the stretcher alignment, coordinating with the receiving medical team to ensure a smooth and uninterrupted transfer. Dr. Grant gave final confirmation of stability as the handoff process began, her attention still, partially on the monitor while overseeing the transition. The stretcher was carefully guided out of the vehicle, and Rex moved in perfect synchronization beside it, never breaking proximity, maintaining his steady presence as the group entered the receiving area of the medical center. Inside the facility, the environment shifted to structured clinical order, with additional medical personnel stepping in to continue care, while the stabilization readings remained consistent and within safe parameters. Ethan watched as the transfer continued smoothly, his posture easing slightly now that the critical transport phase had been successfully completed. Rex remained beside Noah until the final repositioning of the stretcher was complete, his presence unwavering even as clinical teams took full control of the procedure. For a brief moment, as the transition finalized, Noah turned his head one last time toward Rex, his expression calm and stable, before the medical team guided him deeper into the facility for continued treatment. The medical center corridor was filled with a steady rhythm of controlled movement, as staff members guided the stretcher deeper into the emergency intake area where monitoring systems and diagnostic equipment were already prepared for continued care. Noah Carter was now fully inside the facility, his condition marked as stable but still under close observation, with Dr. Melissa Grant walking alongside the stretcher while completing her final transfer report on a handheld device. Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker followed a few steps behind, his presence no longer operational but observational, ensuring continuity until full handoff was complete. Rex remained directly beside the stretcher, his movement synchronized with every turn and stop, never increasing distance beyond what was necessary for medical navigation, maintaining the same calm focus he had held since the initial discovery at the crash site. Noah's eyes were now fully open, his awareness significantly improved, and his expression carried a quiet clarity that had not been present earlier, as he looked around the unfamiliar hospital environment before briefly shifting his attention back to Rex. The German shepherd remained composed, his posture steady even as hospital staff moved around them, adjusting equipment and preparing the next stage of evaluation. Dr. Grant completed the final data entry and spoke softly. Transfer complete, patient stable on arrival, continued neurological recovery observed. Ethan nodded once, his attention easing slightly as the operational phase concluded and responsibility shifted fully to the hospital team. The stretcher was guided into a secure treatment bay, where additional medical staff began a full diagnostic assessment, carefully connecting monitoring equipment and reviewing the patient's updated vitals in real time. Rex remained beside Noah as long as he was allowed, his presence unbroken even as the environment became more clinical and structured, his eyes never leaving the child's face. Noah turned his head slightly toward Rex one last time, his expression calm and composed, showing no signs of distress, only a quiet awareness that seemed to acknowledge the continuity of presence beside him. Dr. Grant observed this final interaction and noted it briefly before stepping back to allow the hospital team full access to the patient. Ethan stood near the entrance of the bay, watching as the medical personnel transitioned fully into care protocol, his posture now relaxed, signaling the end of active emergency involvement. Rex was gently guided by hospital staff to remain outside the immediate treatment area, though he resisted only in the sense that he did not willingly break visual contact until the stretcher disappeared further into the facility. For a moment, he stood still in the corridor, facing the direction where Noah had been taken, his breathing slow and controlled, as if processing the absence of the presence he had been anchored to throughout the entire journey. Ethan approached slowly and placed a calm hand near Rex's shoulder, not restraining but acknowledging, and together they stood in silence as the sounds of the hospital continued around them. Dr. Grant joined them a few steps later, reviewing her final notes before closing the file, her expression now softened by the outcome of the case she had just completed. "He is going to recover," she said quietly, not as speculation but as professional assessment supported by continuous observation data. Ethan exhaled slowly, looking toward the treatment area before nodding once, while Rex remained still, his attention finally easing as the immediate connection he had maintained was no longer physically within reach. The corridor remained active with hospital movement, but the central urgency had passed, leaving only the steady continuation of care behind closed doors. For the first time since the wrecked ambulance had been discovered on the forest road, there was no longer crisis, only recovery in progress, and a quiet understanding among those who had been present that something unexplainable had contributed to a fragile life finding stability again.